Hi, this is Joe Hanley. I'm a lecturer in social work at the Open University, and I'm trying something a little bit new here to make some of what I write a little bit more accessible to people. So please go easy on me when it comes to feedback, but also please give me some feedback because I'm probably going to need it. This is not something I've done before. So I'm going to try to talk today about an article that I had recently published in Critical Social Policy called Networks of Power and Counterpower in Social Work with Children and Families in England. Admittedly, probably not the best title I've ever come up with, and it's the kind of title that probably would have put me off reading this, certainly if I was a student. But I guess that also is another reason why I think this video is important to help make it a little bit more accessible. So this article takes the work of Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells, and he writes a lot about the network society. So very quickly, the network society, he suggests, is the society that we live in today. And because of all the technology that we have today, the internet, phones in our pockets, computers everywhere, always connected, we now live in a society that's organized around networks, not organized about communities or organizations, but organized around networks. And these networks can span the globe sometimes because you can talk to anyone around the globe almost instantly, or certainly anyone who's connected almost instantly. There's obviously a lot more details about the theory of the network society in the article, but that's a quick overview. So I apply that to social work with children and families in England today. And there's a lot of interest in kind of networks and dominant networks in social work in England today. And I think a lot of people are seeing that there is a kind of group at the top of individuals, often made up of a lot of people who aren't social work qualified, who are kind of controlling and dominating social work policy, and that influences all of us. So a lot of the research out there that looks at these networks already identifies that a lot of the same people, the networks are changeable and flexible and malleable, and Castells would say that actually you need that in order to survive and proliferate in this new society that we live in. But they do point to the same individuals, and a lot of the time, so some of them that I talk about in the article are Isabel Trower, the chief social worker for children and families in England, and her links to financial and political networks. Josh Mcallister, who's currently leading the Children's Social Care Review in England, and he founded Frontline, a Teach First style training organization for social workers that is quite controversial in what it does. And at the same time as these people are in the dominant network, what's written about networks in social work also identify that other organizations, groups, individuals become marginalized because they don't share the same views, logic, thoughts as those in the dominant network. So the theory of the network society is really helpful to help us understand why people in the dominant network who are creating these policies, and even though they seem really sincere, policies that they create don't seem to always work or make sense even. That's because a lot of the time these people are meeting the same people over and over again, the same people who are invited to the table, and they might do tokenistic consultations, but ultimately it's the same views and consensus. So they think that there's this consensus in the dominant network, while at the same time, those who are resisting and challenging the decisions and policy and saying, what you're doing doesn't make sense, it hasn't worked before, or we tried it before, sometimes, very often actually, the people in the dominant network don't understand that resistance because they're barely speaking the same language. They don't have the same frames of reference. They don't have the same logic and codes. So again, I talk a lot more about the dominant networks, but what I really try to focus on in this article is counterpower and networks of counterpower and social movement. So Castells also talks about these a lot. He talks about the Arab Spring movement, Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and he points to some common characteristics about these movements. So they reject political parties or existing political parties. They don't really have formalized leadership. They've got evolving and open-ended aims. They engage in, a lot through information communication technology in a very horizontal way. And these techniques and this way of existing can really frustrate dominant networks, because dominant networks tend to, I guess, bite back against resistance by either co-option, which is probably the preferred one, or by stamping out them. And without a clear leader or even clear organizational structure, doing that's really difficult, because who are you going to co-opt? Who are you going to stamp out? Because these are social movements resisting based on the same logic as dominant elites control, networks. So I talk a lot more about that, but I think one of the goals of networks that's important to highlight is that they share these. One of the goals of social movements, I should say, is that they share hope to overcome fear. So Castells writes a lot about fear, and fear is something that I'm sure a lot of social workers are very familiar with. You've got fitness to practice proceedings, inspections, you've got the regulator, you've got the fear of just being named and shamed in public if you fail or you don't do exactly, or something goes wrong, I should say. You maybe something that you did absolutely right, but something just went wrong. And so sharing kind of our hope through networks can help people overcome that fear. And it can also help people step aside from dominant networks and understand that there's networks out there to support them. So I finished the article by talking about a few challenges for social workers. So some of the most important ones are to identify and challenge dominant networks. So one of the ways that dominant networks survive is that it's really difficult to identify them, and you've got people changing roles, and you don't really know who to, similar to the way that dominant networks don't really know how to focus their attention to overcome resistance they face. People in resistance really struggle to understand dominant networks. And, we all understand that the leadership in social work is a bit all over the place. You've got chief social workers, regulators, professional organizations, academic organizations. Who's really in charge here? And the answer is everybody and no one. But that allows these networks to proliferate. So taking the time to kind of identify the people who are constantly involved in decision making and policy is really important, and can take away some of that inflexibility, because then suddenly we're able to see what's going on. Another challenge is really transparency, and the idea of, we live in a world of almost infinite potential for sharing information and being open and transparent, and yet policymaking still mostly takes place behind closed doors by a small select group of people. So if you're invited to that group of people, refuse to be involved, and say, yeah, I'll be involved if you're more open in your process, and maybe that might help shift and change things. And I also have a few challenges there about developing networks of hope and engaging with the communities and people that we support, that I think are really important too. But I'm well over my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop talking. I'll have a link to the article in the description below. If there's anyone who needs a copy or wants a copy, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me if the paywall becomes a barrier. And I really hope that this was helpful for you. Thanks.